much. Let me start with Chairwoman Ohlhausen. Is there a reliable financial macro cost to scams in the United States? Do we know what this, aside from the personal aspects of this, what does it cost the economy?
Well, based on the redress that the FTC has been able to get for consumers, even just last year, it costs billions and billions of dollars. So we get redress for consumers, and last year we were able to get more than $1 billion, well, several $1 billion. A lot of that was driven by the VW settlement, which was about $10 or $11 billion. So it is billions and billions of dollars.
Mr. Schwanke, in your investigation and your attempt to help Kansans, have you discovered any place that it makes most sense for a victim to go with their problem? Who is best at providing relief and satisfaction?
I think that's a lot of their frustration. I think once they've been victim of a scam, they often turn to the Better Business Bureau or us to warn others, and oftentimes they understand that that is their only option at that point, is to stop it from happening to anyone else. Calling law enforcement often goes nowhere just because they can't do anything.
You indicated something that was discouraging to me, because one of the conversations we've had already just in this hearing is the value of information. But you indicated that a particular instance, the victim had seen the similar or identical fraud being talked about on your program, but still felt necessary to respond to the cries of a grandchild. Do you have evidence that this consumer awareness actually makes a difference? Do you have instances in which you've been told, I saw your program, it warned me, and the same thing about happened to me, but I knew not to fall for it?
That's one example. Oftentimes we do hear from victims who say, I knew better, and when they see these stories of victims, they sit back in their home and think, how in the world could I ever fall for something like that? In that case, she saw our story, and she explained it as tunnel vision. And I think that's what these scammers depend on. When I talk to these senior groups and I lay out these scams, and even the crowd will say, well, I would never fall for that. But I use her as an example of once she thought that her granddaughter was in trouble, she said it was almost like I had blinders on. And that's the only thing I could see at that point. So in that story, that is really what she tried to get across to viewers, is you really have to stop and think, because you're not going to be thinking clearly when someone calls for a grandparent scam or someone calls claiming to be with the IRS saying that they're going to haul you off to jail if you don't pay your taxes. Once you hear that, your mind shuts off oftentimes. So that's what we try to get across in our education.
General, you've been involved in public service announcements, evidence that they're useful, successful, and prevent additional fraud?
We do get calls, Mr. Chairman, from people, and sometimes I'll actually see people who say, I saw you on TV talking about the grandparent scam, or I saw you on TV talking about the IRS scam. While we are successful in some prosecutions, the ones that are over the internet, the ones that are long distance, are very, very difficult for all the reasons that have already been stated. And frankly, we think that our prime job in this case is to really warn people. This is trying to warn them about this. So yes, we have some results, but it's the same. We've all, I think, had the same experience. You know, many times people say, I never would have thought I would fall for this, but I did. And what I think the public sometimes thinks is, well, I wouldn't do that. Or they think, you know, these are people who aren't very smart. That's not true. These are smart people. These are average, just regular people who you find in Ohio, and because some button has been pushed, whether it is the compassion for your grandchild, or in the case of the IRS scam, where they call you up and threaten you, it's just total fear. That emotion overrides.
Mr. Abagnale, what the perpetrator of a fraud, what is it about them that allows them to be able to elicit that response from somebody who is apparently smart and has seen information about the potential scam and still falls for it? What's the way to capture somebody?
Well, first of all, thank God that the majority of Americans are honest, and because they're honest, they don't think in a deceptive way. So when the phone rings and the caller ID says it's the Internal Revenue Service or United States government or their local police department, they believe that to be true. They're not aware that the caller ID is easily manipulated. So people believe at the start that the call is legitimate, and then the person on the other end of that call can be very, very persuasive in getting people to give them information or to get money from them with some of these scams that we've heard about here today that are very common. Now, we've said so much about the IRS scam over the last few years and have reached so many American citizens about it that the criminal is now changing gears a little bit, realizing that a lot of people know that when you get a call from the IRS demanding money, that the IRS usually doesn't make phone calls, that they would write you a letter. So the scammers in the last year have started writing letters on the IRS letterhead, postage paid by the federal government over in the right-hand corner of the envelope, and mailing out letters supposedly from the IRS with a reference number up in the top right corner and simply saying to call this 800 number to speak with agent so-and-so. And of course, someone answers, Internal Revenue, that connects you to that person who's not really that person. So as you can see, they're able to understand how it works. When it gets a little tight or they realize people are catching on, they switch gears a little bit and go to something a little more sophisticated. Again, through my entire career, I believe that if you explain to people these scams, you tell them how they work, that's the best way to prevent those scams from occurring. When I go out with ARP Fraud Watch Network, I spend my afternoon on the phone speaking to about 15,000 people who call in to the ARP's office, state office, and get on the line and they hear about all these scams. They get to ask me questions about things that have happened to them and how to understand how some of these work. I find that as a very powerful tool of reaching people and getting that information. It's interesting to me that back in the 70s, before there was ever a book about me, I did some public service ads for the Department of Justice that were given to police departments across the country. Those ads ran for years on television. They were 30-second ads. Police department was able to put their logo at the end of it, sponsored from that police department. In the 1980s, only a book had been written about me. Most people didn't know who I was, but I actually did millions of bank statement stuffers for banks that went out to people in their bank statement, and it had tips about protecting their checkbook, protecting their credit cards. Today, there is very little of that. We very rarely see public service ads on TV. We very rarely see that reaching out to explain to people what is going on. I think we need to get back to that. It's very important, and it's the only way to really fight crime is through education. And I think that that's the way that I try to approach it in the 40 years I've been doing this. I would remind you, the committee, of one thing. I always teach FBI agents to follow the money, and have for 4 decades. So what we find is that most of these crimes that are committed by people living in Russia, India, China, that are making these calls in their pajamas or on their laptop from their kitchen, are stealing money from the American consumer. It is leaving our economy, but it will come back. It always comes back because it will tend to boomerang and return to our country, but in the form of drug trafficking, human trafficking, child pornography, and much more hideous crimes. So it is very important that we try to prevent that money getting in the wrong hands of people who are going to do a lot worse, commit a lot worse crimes with that money.
Thank you. Senator Blumenthal.